A millionaire single father humiliated the housekeeper, but when her daughter shouted in defense of her mother, his reaction was unexpected. A story that will touch your heart. Subscribe, leave your like, and comment where you are watching from. The shrill sound of crystal shattering against Carrara marble echoed through the three-story mansion in New York, cutting through the afternoon silence like a sharp blade. Edward Mason abruptly stopped in the middle of the main staircase, his strong, calloused hand gripping the imported mahogany railing. At 43 years old, the businessman had been running Mason Construction with an iron fist for nearly 2 decades, transforming a small company inherited from his father into one of the largest construction firms in the country. But at that moment, faced with the screams coming from the kitchen, he felt completely lost. "Your mother is incompetent. She can't even make juice without spilling everything." Bella's shrill voice, his 17-year-old daughter, pierced through the hallways of the house like a hurricane. "Dad only hired you because you're cheap." Edward descended the stairs 3 at a time, his Italian leather shoes thudding against the marble in a rapid rhythm. The family guilt he had carried for 5 years since the death of Helen, his wife, weighed on his shoulders like an anchor. He knew Bella was like this because of him, rebellious, aggressive, lost. Since Helen had died of cancer when the girl was only 12, Edward had thrown himself into work as a way to escape the pain, leaving his daughter adrift in a sea of sadness and emotional neglect. As he turned the corner leading to the spacious gourmet kitchen, Edward stopped suddenly. There was Mary Johnson, the new housekeeper who had started working in the house just 3 weeks ago. She was 35, with brown hair tied back in a simple bun, wearing the navy blue uniform he had custom-made. What surprised him was not seeing her cleaning up the shards of glass from the glass that Bella had thrown on the floor in a fit of rage, but rather her dignified posture while doing so. "I'm sorry for the inconvenience, Miss Bella," Mary said in a calm voice. But Edward could see the slight tremor in her hands as she picked up the larger pieces. "I'll get you another glass right away," Bella huffed, tossing her long blonde hair over her shoulder. A gesture she had inherited from her mother that always made Edward's heart tighten. The girl was a younger version of Helen, the same piercing blue eyes, the same delicate nose, the same stubbornness that had so enchanted Edward when he met his wife in business school. "You don't need to bother," Bella replied with venomous sarcasm. "I've lost my appetite anyway. The smell of poverty in this kitchen makes me sick." It was at that moment that Edward saw a small figure appear in the doorway leading to the service area. Sophie, Mary's daughter, was only 8 years old, but her brown eyes sparkled with a determination that reminded him of her mother's eyes. The girl wore a simple pink dress, clearly homemade, and her pigtails were a bit messy, as if she had run to get there. "Don't talk about my mum like that." Sophie's high-pitched voice cut through the tense air of the kitchen like lightning. Tears began to stream down her rosy cheeks, but she did not back down. "My mum is the smartest person in the world. She can read difficult books and teaches me math and English. You're the rude one." The silence that followed was deafening. Bella stood there, mouth agape, clearly not expecting to be confronted by a child. Mary quickly stood up, the glass shard still in her hands. "Sophie, go back to your room now," Mary said firmly, but Edward could hear the pride disguised in her voice. "And apologize to Miss Bella." "I'm not going to apologize." Sophie crossed her skinny arms over her chest. "She's the one who should apologize to you. My teacher at school said that when someone is rude, we can say we didn't like it." Edward felt something break inside his chest. It wasn't anger or irritation. It was something he hadn't felt in a long time, a mix of admiration and tenderness that caught him completely off guard. That little girl, with her homemade dress and messy pigtails, had more courage and dignity than many adults he knew in the business world. "Sophie!" Mary tried to approach her daughter, but Edward stepped forward. "Wait," he said, his voice sounding softer than he intended. All eyes turned to him, Bella with surprise, Mary with apprehension, and Sophie with curiosity. "The girl is right," Bella's blue eyes widened. "Dad, you can't be serious." Edward looked at his daughter, truly seeing her for the first time in a long time. He saw the pain hidden behind the anger, the fear disguised as arrogance, the loneliness she carried like armor. Helen always said that hurt people sometimes hurt others, and that was exactly what he saw in Bella at that moment. "I'm very serious," Edward replied, directing his gaze to Mary. "Mrs. Johnson, I apologize for the inappropriate behavior you witnessed in my home, and," he bent down to be at Sophie's height, "thank you for defending your mother. That shows you were very well-mannered by her." Sophie blinked several times, as if she couldn't believe what she was hearing. Then a shy smile appeared on her round face. "My mom taught me that we always have to defend the people we love," she said, with the devastating simplicity of children, "even when we're scared." Edward felt a tightness in his chest. When was the last time someone had defended something with such passion in his home? When was the last time he himself had shown the courage to defend the people he loved? Mary stormed out of the kitchen, but Edward noticed that she looked at Sophie with a different expression, no longer one of disdain, but of curiosity, perhaps even envy for that courage she herself could no longer demonstrate. "Mr. Mason," Mary began, her voice cautious, "I understand if you prefer that I find another job. I can't allow Sophie to cause problems in your home." Edward shook his head slowly. "Mrs. Johnson, problems existed in this house long before you arrived. Your daughter simply had the courage to speak the truth." He paused, observing how Sophie clung to her mother's skirt. "In fact, I think you two might be exactly what this family needs." At that moment, as the afternoon sun filtered through the large kitchen windows, illuminating Mary's brown hair and Sophie's determined little face, Edward Mason had no idea that he had just witnessed the first act of a transformation that would completely change his life over the next 14 months. 3 weeks had passed since the incident with the broken glass, and Edward had begun to notice subtle changes in the household routine. Every morning, as he descended for coffee before heading to the office, he found the table set with almost military precision. Perfectly folded linen napkins, aligned cutlery, and always a small arrangement of flowers picked from the mansion's garden. But it wasn't just the practical details that caught his attention. It was the silent and efficient presence of Mary, who moved through the house like an organizing shadow. On the first Monday of December, Edward woke up earlier than usual. The digital clock on the bedside table read 5:30 a.m. when he decided to get up, defeated by the insomnia that had plagued him since he discovered some troubling irregularities in the construction company's contracts. He put on a navy blue silk robe and descended the stairs toward the kitchen, planning to make a strong coffee before reviewing some documents in the office. As he approached the kitchen, Edward heard an unexpected sound, the soft rustle of pages being turned. The light was on, casting a golden rectangle over the dark hallway. Intrigued, he approached silently and stopped at the door, observing a scene that left him completely surprised. Mary was sitting at the kitchen table, still wearing a simple light blue cotton pajama with a stack of books and study materials spread out in front of her. Her loose hair fell over her shoulders as she concentrated on writing in a notebook, occasionally consulting a thick dictionary that Edward recognized as belonging to the office library. She must have borrowed it. A steaming cup of tea sat beside her, and the expression on her face was one of pure determination. "Good study night?" Edward asked softly, causing Mary to jump and drop her pen on the floor. "Mr. Mason!" She quickly stood up, her cheeks flushing intensely. I'm sorry. I didn't expect you to be awake. I can explain. Edward raised his hand in a reassuring gesture and stepped into the kitchen. You don't need to explain anything. I'm just curious. He approached the table and saw that the study materials were for a preparatory course for the public service exam, specifically for the position of teacher in the municipal school system. May I ask what you're studying? Mary hesitated for a moment, her fingers nervously drumming on the table. I graduated in education from NYU, she finally said, her voice almost a whisper. I graduated 10 years ago, but I never secured a permanent position as a teacher. When Sophie's father, when he abandoned us, I had to take any job to support my daughter. Edward felt something constricting in his chest. And now you're studying for what? For the New York City Department of Education exam. The applications closed last week, and the test is in March. Mary lowered her eyes as if ashamed. I know it may seem ungrateful of me to study to leave a job when you've been so kind to us, but... Mary? Edward interrupted her, using her name for the first time without the formal Mrs. Look at me. She raised her brown eyes, and he saw a mix of fear and hope in them. Can I ask a personal question? She nodded timidly. Why didn't you tell me about your degree when I hired you? Mary sighed deeply, her hands intertwining on the table. Because people become uncomfortable when they find out that the housekeeper has a college degree. They start to question why an educator is cleaning their homes instead of being in a classroom. And the truth is humiliating. Edward pulled out a chair and sat at the table, a gesture that clearly surprised Mary. Tell me the truth. For a moment she seemed to consider whether to trust him. Then, as if a dam had burst, the words began to flow. When I finished college, I got pregnant with Sophie. Her father, Robert, was a lawyer I met in college. He promised he would marry me, that he would take care of both of us. Mary's voice turned bitter. 2 weeks before Sophie was born, he told me he had decided to marry the daughter of the partner at the firm where he worked. He said I didn't fit into his world. Edward felt a familiar anger rising in his chest, the same one he felt when he saw injustices in the business world. I had to move in with my mother in Brooklyn, Mary continued. Sophie was born premature and spent 2 months in the neonatal ICU. There were bills and more bills from the hospital. My mother sold sweets at the train station to help, and I started working as a housekeeper because the salary was immediate and schools required experience that I didn't have. And Sophie's father? Did he never help financially? Mary let out a humorless laugh. He moved to the United States right after she was born. New life, new family. For him, we never existed. Edward fell silent for a few moments, absorbing the story. He looked at the study materials scattered across the table: English, math, pedagogical knowledge, didactics. Marissa's determination to change her situation was evident in every marked page, every careful note in the margins. How long have you been studying for this exam? 2 years, Marissa replied. I study at night on weekends whenever Sophie is asleep. I've taken 3 exams in other cities, but I always end up as one of the first alternates. I never manage to secure a spot. And this time? This time will be different, she said with a conviction that impressed Edward. Sophie is older now. She can help me more. And she hesitated. I am more prepared. More desperate, too. Edward stood up and went to the coffee machine, preparing 2 cups. Can I ask another question? Of course. Why did you choose to work here? My daughter hasn't exactly been welcoming. Marissa accepted the cup of coffee Edward offered her, her hands warming against the porcelain. Because Sophie needs to see that it's possible to be treated with dignity, even when working for others. And because... She paused. Because I saw something in you when we talked during the interview. You seemed sad in the same way I sometimes feel." The brutal honesty of her response hit Edward like a punch to the stomach. He sat down again, this time closer to her. "Marissa, can I say something?" "Yes." "My daughter has been suffering a lot since she lost her mother. She directs all that anger at the wrong people because she doesn't know how to deal with the pain. It's not an excuse for her behavior, but it's an explanation." "I know," Marissa said softly. "I lost my father when I was 15. Anger is easier than sadness." Edward looked at her, really looked, for the first time. He saw the small wrinkles around her eyes that spoke of sleepless nights and constant worries. He saw her well-kept but calloused hands of someone who works hard. He saw the silent dignity of a woman who had not let circumstances break her. "Want some advice?" "Always," she replied. "Keep studying. Keep fighting for your dreams. And when you pass this exam, I didn't say if, I said when. I want to be the first to congratulate you." Marissa smiled for the first time since Edward had met her, a genuine smile that completely lit up her face. "Thank you, Mr. Mason. That means more than you can imagine." That morning, as they talked about dreams, losses, and new beginnings, Edward realized he had found something he wasn't looking for, a person whose silent strength was beginning to awaken parts of himself that he had buried along with Helen. June arrived in New York with its characteristic persistent drizzle and the aroma of mulled wine wafting through the city streets. Edward had always hated school festivals. He found them noisy, disorganized, and a waste of time. But on that Friday, June 23rd, something made him stop when he heard Sophie excitedly talking with Marissa in the kitchen about her school's festival. "Mum, you promised you would come see me dance," the girl's high-pitched voice echoed through the house. "The teacher said that anyone without family at the festival will be very sad." Edward was descending the stairs when he heard Marissa's response, laden with contained sadness. "Honey, you know Mommy needs to work. Mr. Mason has an important dinner tonight with the Japanese investors, and I need to stay to organize everything." "But Mom—" Sophie's little voice trembled, and Edward could imagine her eyes filling with tears. "Sophie, don't insist. Life isn't always how we want it. You'll dance beautifully even without Mommy watching, and then you can tell me all about it at home, okay?" Edward stopped halfway down the stairs, his hand gripping the mahogany railing. The memory of Helen pleading for him to attend Beatrice's dance performances at school hit him like a punch to the gut. How many times had he said exactly the same words? "I need to work. It's important for business. You understand, don't you?" How many unshed tears from his own daughter weighed on his conscience. In that moment, he made an impulsive decision that surprised even himself. "Marissa!" he called, descending the last steps. She appeared in the kitchen doorway with Sophie clinging to her skirt. "Cancel tonight's dinner. Tell the Japanese that we'll reschedule for Monday." "But sir, they came all the way from Japan for—" "Marissa!" Edward interrupted, crouching down to Sophie's level. "What time does the festival start at your school?" The girl's brown eyes widened. "At 6 o'clock, Mr. Edward, but—" "No buts. Your mother needs to see you dance." He looked at Marissa, who was staring at him with a look of utter disbelief. "And I'm going to take you both." "Mr. Mason, you don't have to—" "I know I don't have to," Edward stood up, "but I want to." At 5:30 in the evening, Edward found himself driving his black BMW through the narrow streets of the neighborhood where Sophie's school was located. In the back seat, the girl chattered non-stop about the dance steps, while Marissa, sitting in the passenger seat, remained, visibly nervous. "Mr. Mason," she said softly while Sophie was distracted looking out the window, "you have no idea what this means to her. Since she started school, Sophie has been the only child whose parents have never attended any event." "Parents?" Edward questioned, frowning. Marissa blushed slightly. "Sorry, that was a figure of speech. I mean, guardians. But Edward had caught something in her voice, a vulnerability that touched him deeply. For the first time, he considered how difficult it must be for Sophie to explain to her classmates why she didn't have a present father. Miss Helen. Antipoff's school was transformed for the festivities. Colourful banners adorned the yard, stalls sold typical sweets, and the aroma of corn pudding and peanut candy filled the air. Edward felt slightly out of place in his Italian suit, amidst that crowd of simple families dressed in country attire. "Mom, you really came," Sophie shouted upon spotting Marissa, running to hug her. Then she stopped and looked at Edward shyly. "And Mr. Edward came too." "Of course I did," Edward said, realizing it was true. He wasn't there just out of obligation. "I wouldn't miss your performance for anything." For the next 40 minutes, Edward experienced something completely new. Sitting in a white plastic chair between a retired seamstress and a bus driver, he watched Sophie dance at the school festival in a checkered dress that Marissa had sewn by hand. The girl radiated pure joy, her eyes constantly searching for her mother in the audience to make sure she was really there. "She looks beautiful," commented the retired seamstress, Mrs. Thompson. "Is she your granddaughter?" Edward was about to correct her when he heard Marissa respond, "No, she's my daughter, and this is a family friend." A family friend. The words echoed strangely in Edward's mind. When was the last time someone considered him simply a friend without any interest in his money or influence? The performance was nearing its end when the heavy clouds that had threatened New York all day finally opened up. The rain began as a light drizzle, but quickly turned into a typical downpour of New York winters. The schoolyard became chaotic, children screaming, parents rushing to protect their kids, organizers trying to move everything inside the building. "Sophie!" Marissa shouted, trying to locate her daughter amidst the confusion. Edward saw her first. The girl was standing in the middle of the yard, crying, her checkered dress soaked, her hair stuck to her face. Without thinking twice, he took off his blazer and ran to her, covering her with the piece of clothing. "Come on, little one," he said, picking her up. "Let's get out of the rain." "My dress," Sophie sobbed. "Mommy made it with so much love, and now it's all wet." "Don't worry," Edward said, running toward the car with her in his arms. "Your mum can make another one that's even prettier." In the car, while Marissa tried to dry Sophie with the towel, she had brought in her bag. The girl asked a question that caught Edward completely off guard. "Mr. Edward, could you be my dad? Then you would come to all the school parties, and I wouldn't be the only one without a dad." The silence that followed was deafening. Edward looked in the rearview mirror and saw Sophie's hopeful eyes, then met Marissa's gaze, who looked mortified. "Sophie," Marissa reprimanded, "you can't say things like that. Apologize to Mr. Edward right now." "You don't need to apologize," Edward said gently, stopping the car at the traffic light. He turned to look directly at Sophie. "Did you know I have a daughter about your age? Well, she's much older, but sometimes I forget that." "Really?" Sophie asked, her eyes lighting up. "Really? And you know what? I would have loved to be the kind of dad who goes to school parties. Maybe you can teach me how to be a better dad." Sophie smiled, and Marissa looked at Edward with a silent gratitude that made him feel as if he had just accomplished something far more important than any business deal he had ever closed. When they arrived at the 3-story mansion, an hour later, Bella was waiting in the living room, clearly annoyed at having been left alone during dinner. But upon seeing Sophie walk through the door, still wearing Edward's wet blazer, her expression shifted to curiosity. "Why are you all wet?" she asked. "We went to Sophie's school festival," Edward explained, taking the blazer off the girl's shoulders. "And you two are going to take a hot shower before you catch a cold." As Marissa took Sophie to their room, Bella approached her father. "You cancelled dinner with the Japanese to go to a public school festival?" "I did," Why? Edward looked at his daughter, really looked, and saw something he hadn't seen in a long time, genuine curiosity, without hostility. Because some things are more important than business, Bella, and because I've missed too many parties in your life. I didn't want Sophie to go through the same thing. Bella was silent for a moment. Then, surprisingly, she said, "Next time? Can you invite me? I've never been to a real school festival." That night, as he lay down, Edward realized that something fundamental had changed within him. Sophie's innocent question, "Could you be my dad?" had planted a seed he didn't even know he wanted to grow. July arrived with the dry cold typical of New York winters, and Edward noticed that his insomnia was becoming more frequent. It wasn't just the construction company's problems that kept him awake. Some irregularities in the contracts had been discovered by internal audit, and he suspected that his former partner, Charles, had forged documents without his knowledge before leaving the company. What really troubled him were the strange dreams he had begun to have. Helen appeared in them, not as the sick wife from her last months of life, but as the radiant woman he had known in college, and she always said the same thing. "You are waking up, Edward. You are finally waking up." It was a Tuesday, 3 in the morning, when Edward went down to the kitchen in search of a glass of water. Over the past 2 months, he had discovered that Marissa had the habit of studying late at night, and a part of him, which he preferred not to analyze too deeply, hoped to find her there. She had become a comforting presence in his home, someone he could talk to without social masks or business interests. But upon entering the kitchen, Edward found a scene different from the usual. Bella was sitting at the table, still wearing a pink silk pajama, with tears silently streaming down her face. Marissa was beside her. One of the hands delicately rested on the teenager's shoulder, whispering words of comfort that Edward couldn't fully hear. "It's not your fault, dear." Edward caught fragments of the conversation. "Death is not something we choose or control." "But I was so horrible to her in the last months," Bella sobbed. "I yelled because she was always tired, complained when she couldn't take me places. I didn't understand she was dying." Edward paused at the door, his heart contracting painfully. In the 5 years since Helen's death, Bella had never openly talked about the guilt she carried. With him, she maintained a barrier of aggression that prevented any deep conversation. "Bella," Mary said softly, "you were 12. No one expects a child to fully understand a situation as complex as a terminal illness." "But Dad understood," Bella exploded. "He knew Mom was dying and still worked all the time. At least he had an excuse. He's an adult and was scared. I was just a spoiled brat wanting attention." Edward felt his daughter's words like daggers to his chest. She knew. Somehow, that 12-year-old girl had realized he was escaping to work instead of facing the hospital because he couldn't handle the prospect of losing Helen. "Your father was hurting just as much as you were," Mary replied. "Sometimes adults cope with pain in ways that seem wrong, but make sense to them at that moment. That doesn't mean they don't love." "He hates me," Bella murmured. "I look just like Mom, and every time he looks at me, he remembers her. That's why he and can't be near me." "That's not true!" The response escaped Edward's mouth before he could control himself. Both women turned, surprised by his presence. Bella quickly wiped her tears, her expression returning to her usual defensive mask. "How long have you been listening?" Edward stepped into the kitchen, feeling more vulnerable than he had in years. "Long enough to know I need to have an honest conversation with my daughter for a long time." "Edward," Mary stood up. "Maybe I should—" "Please stay," Edward asked, surprising himself. "If you don't mind, I think I need a witness to have the courage to speak the truth." Mary looked from Edward to Bella, who nodded almost imperceptibly and sat back down. Edward pulled out a chair and sat across from his daughter. "Bella, I never hated you, not for a second of your life." "Then why do you run away from me all the time?" Bella's direct question hit him like a punch. Edward took a deep breath, searching for the right words. "Because you're right. Every time I look at you, I see your mother. But that's not why you think." He paused, noticing that Mary was watching him with silent attention, as if she knew this conversation could change everything. "When I look at you, I see all the moments I lost with your mother. I see all the times I chose to stay another hour at the office instead of having dinner with you. I see all the weekends I worked instead of going to the park or the movies. And when your mother got sick," his voice faltered. "What happened when she got sick, Dad?" Edward looked directly into his daughter's blue eyes, the same eyes as Helen's. "I was so afraid of losing her that I stopped living with her. I dove into work because it was easier than sitting by the hospital bed, watching her fade away. And the worst part is that when she died, I realized I had lost not just my wife, but also the last months I could have spent with her." Bella fell silent, fresh tears streaming down her face. "And then," Edward continued, "when I looked at you, I saw not just your mother, but also my own cowardice. I saw how I had failed as a husband and as a father. It was easier to keep my distance than to face the fact that I was repeating the same mistakes with you." "Did you think I was going to die too?" Bella asked quietly. "No." Edward shook his head. "I thought I would hurt you like I hurt your mother. I thought that if I stayed away, you would suffer less." Mary leaned slightly forward. "Can I say something?" Father and daughter looked at her. "You both are suffering for the same reason. You think you are responsible for things that are beyond your control. Bella, you are not responsible for being a normal child who wanted attention from her mother. And Edward," she looked directly at him, "you are not responsible for Helen's death. Cancer killed your wife, not your absences." "But I could have been more present," Edward began. "You could have," Mary agreed. "But that wouldn't have changed the outcome, and now you both have a choice. You can continue punishing yourselves for the past, or you can start building something new together." Bella looked at her father, and for the first time in years, Edward saw not anger or resentment in her eyes, but cautious hope. "Dad," she said hesitantly, would you miss me if I died?" The question completely broke down Edward's defenses. He opened his arms, and Bella, after a moment of hesitation, allowed him to embrace her. "Bella," he whispered into his daughter's golden hair, "you are the most precious thing your mother left me. I would miss you every day of my life." Father and daughter held each other for a few minutes, 5 years of hurt and misunderstandings beginning to dissolve. When they finally pulled apart, Bella looked at Mary. "Thank you," she said simply, "for listening to me without judgment." "Thank you for trusting me," Mary replied. Edward looked at the two women, his daughter, who had finally begun to... He opened up, and Marissa, who had facilitated a miracle he thought impossible. "Marissa," he said, "how did you know exactly what to say?" She smiled sadly. "Because I too have carried burdens that weren't mine, and I learned that sometimes we need someone from the outside to help us see that we are harder on ourselves than we should be." That early morning, as the three talked about loss, forgiveness, and new beginnings, Edward realized that Marissa had become much more than a housekeeper in his home. She had become the bridge that reconnects a shattered family, and for the first time since Mrs. Helen's death, Edward began to imagine that perhaps it was possible to be happy again. August arrived with a chill that penetrated to the bone, but the cold Edward felt did not come solely from the weather. In the second week of the month, his business life crumbled like a house of cards. The investigation that had started as a routine audit had turned into a nightmare, when the federal police appeared at the headquarters of Mason Construction with search and seizure warrants. Edward was in his office in the 3-story mansion, surrounded by piles of documents and 3 very expensive lawyers, when he learned that his name was being linked to a scheme of overpricing public works. Charles Mendes, his former partner who had left the company 2 years earlier, had apparently forged contracts and used the company's name in illicit dealings without Edward's knowledge. "The situation is serious, Edward," said Dr. Henry Sampaio, his lawyer for 15 years, adjusting his gold-rimmed glasses. "Even if you prove your innocence, and I believe we will, your reputation in the market is compromised. Some clients are already cancelling contracts." Edward ran his hands through his greying hair, feeling the weight of 30 years of honest work being destroyed by someone he had trusted. "How long do we have before this becomes public?" "The first report should come out tomorrow in the major newspapers," Dr. Sampaio replied. "I suggest you prepare your family for what's to come." At 11 o'clock at night, after the lawyers had left, Edward found himself alone in his office, looking out the window at the illuminated garden of the mansion. How would he explain to Bella that they might need to sell the house where she had grown up? How would he tell her that the empire he had built in the name of the family was crumbling? A gentle knock on the door pulled him from his dark thoughts. "Come in," he said, hoping it was Bella. To his surprise, it was Marissa who appeared at the door, carrying a tray with a steaming cup of chamomile tea and some homemade cookies. She wore a simple robe over her pajamas, and her hair was loose, softly framing her worried face. "Sorry to disturb," she said hesitantly. "I saw that the light was still on and thought you might need something." Edward watched her as she placed the tray on his desk, gently pushing aside some papers. There was something infinitely comforting about her presence, a calm he couldn't find even in the best spas or the most expensive vacations. "Thank you," he said, taking the cup. The tea was at the perfect temperature, and the aroma of chamomile immediately began to relax his tense muscles. "How did you know I like chamomile?" "Sophie told me that your mother always made chamomile tea for you when you were worried," Marissa replied, sitting in the armchair across from the desk, a gesture that, months earlier, would have been unthinkable, but now felt natural. "She heard you talking with Mrs. Helen once in the garden." Edward paused with the cup in the air. "Sophie remembers Mrs. Helen?" "Some things. She was quite small when she passed away. But she remembers her voice, her perfume, some conversations." Marissa hesitated. "She told me that Mrs. Helen was kind to the people who worked in the house." "She was," Edward confirmed, his voice softening. "Helen always treated everyone with dignity. She said that a person's true class is revealed in how they treat those who can do nothing for them." They sat in silence for a few minutes, Edward sipping the tea, while Marissa discreetly observed the chaos of papers on the desk. "Can I ask what happened?" she finally said. Edward looked at her, considering whether to share his problems. But the genuine expression of concern on her face convinced him that she was asking because she truly cared, not out of curiosity. "My former partner got me involved in something that could destroy everything I've built," he said simply. "Did you do something wrong?" "No, but sometimes that doesn't matter." Marissa leaned forward, her hands clasped in her lap. "Edward," she said, using his name without the "sir" for the first time, "can I tell you a story?" He nodded. "When Sophie was 5, I worked as a caregiver for an elderly lady, Mrs. Thompson. She was a widow, wealthy, and had 3 children who rarely visited her. I spent 12 hours a day with her, helping with her medications, keeping her company, organizing the house." Marissa paused. "One day, she began to show signs of dementia. Her children suddenly appeared and accused me of stealing her jewelry. They said I had taken advantage of her mental confusion to take valuable things." Edward felt a familiar anger rising in his chest. What happened? They fired me on the spot, without references, without labor rights. They spread around the neighborhood that I was a thief. For 3 months, I couldn't find a job anywhere. Tears shimmered in Marissa's eyes. Sophie went hungry a few times because I didn't have money even for milk. And the jewelry. It was found inside a shoebox in Mrs. Thompson's closet 2 weeks later. She had hidden it herself out of paranoia from the illness. The children never apologized to me, never tried to repair the damage they caused to my reputation. Edward set the cup down on the table, feeling a deep connection with her. Mary had experienced pain. How did you overcome that? I realized that I knew the truth about myself. I knew I had never stolen anything, that I had always treated Mrs. Thompson with kindness and respect. Other people's opinions didn't change who I really was. She looked directly into his eyes. The people who truly matter know your character. The rest is just noise. What if the people who matter start to doubt? Then you discover who really matters, Mary replied with a wisdom that surprised Edward. He watched her for a few moments. This woman who had faced injustices he couldn't even imagine, who had raised a daughter alone amidst adversity, who studied at night dreaming of a better future. Her quiet strength made his problems seem more manageable. Mary, he said, I need to warn you that the coming months might be difficult. The newspapers will publish articles about me. There may be protests in front of the house, and I might need to let some employees go to cut costs. Are you warning me that you might need to let me go? I'm warning you that if you stay, it could be tough for you and Sophie. I don't want you both to be affected by the consequences of my problems. Mary stood up from the armchair and approached the table, placing one hand over the scattered papers. Edward, can I say something? Of course. In the last few months, this house has become more of a home for me and Sophie than any place we've ever lived. Not just because of the material comfort, but because of how we've been treated, with dignity, with kindness. She paused. If you're facing a storm, we won't abandon ship. We'll help navigate through it. Edward felt something stirring in his chest, an emotion he no longer knew how to name. Why? Because that's what families do for each other. The word family echoed in the silent office like a bell. Edward realized that at some point in the last few months, without him consciously noticing, Mary and Sophie had become part of his family in a way he still didn't fully understand. Mary, he said softly, thank you. That means more than you know. She smiled, the same genuine smile that had won his admiration that early morning of studying. Get some rest. Storms always pass, Edward, and they usually leave the air cleaner when they go. That night, for the first time in weeks, Edward managed to sleep for a few hours, and in his dreams, Helen appeared again. But this time she said nothing. She simply smiled and pointed to the window, where the sun was beginning to rise. September arrived with the first signs of spring in New York, and Edward discovered that facing a public crisis was more exhausting than any business challenge he had ever encountered. For 3 weeks, his name graced the covers of major economic newspapers, always accompanied by words like investigation, overpricing, and corruption. Protesters appeared a few times in front of the 3-story mansion, and Bella had to change schools mid-semester because classmates were harassing her with questions about her father. But amidst all this chaos, something unexpected was blossoming. The crisis had united the family in a way Edward had never imagined possible. Bella, instead of rebelling against the situation, had become his fiercest ally, defending him wherever someone dared to question his integrity. And Mary had become his safe harbor, the person he could confide his anxieties to without fear of judgment. It was a Thursday, September 15th, when Edward realized he had completely forgotten about Sophie's birthday. The girl was turning 9 that day, and the only reason he remembered was that he found Mary silently crying in the kitchen while preparing a small homemade cake. "Mary?" Edward approached her, concerned. "What happened?" She quickly dried her eyes with her apron, trying to smile. "It's nothing. It's just that today is Sophie's birthday, and I wanted so much to give her something special. But with all the extra expenses we've had this month—" She paused, clearly embarrassed to admit financial difficulties. Edward felt a tightness in his chest. In recent months, Mary had refused all the salary increases he had tried to give her, claiming she already earned more than she deserved. But the truth was that she spent almost all her money on study materials for the public service exam and clothes, for Sophie, always putting her daughter's needs before her own. "What does Sophie want for a gift?" he asked. "A party," Mary replied with a sad smile. "She always asks for the same thing, a party with her friends from school, with colourful decorations and sweets. But how can we host the kids in our small room? And I don't have money to rent a venue." Edward looked around the spacious kitchen, then at the living room with its Italian leather sofas and panoramic view of the garden. An idea began to form in his mind. "What time does Sophie get back from school?" "At 5 o'clock. Why?" Edward looked at the clock. It was 2 in the afternoon. 3 hours to organize a party. "Mary, do me a favor. Call the school and ask for the phone list of Sophie's friends' parents. Tell them you're throwing a surprise party and invite all the kids from her class." "Edward, I can't—" "You can and you will," he interrupted, already picking up the phone. "And I will call the best children's party planner in New York." "But that must cost a fortune." Edward stopped and looked directly into her eyes. "Mary, in the last few months you have taken care of my daughter as if she were your own. Let me take care of your daughter as if she were mine." Tears returned to Mary's eyes, but this time they were tears of gratitude. The next 3 hours were a whirlwind of activity. Edward called Carla Thompson, the most sought-after party planner in New York, offering to pay triple the normal rate for her to organize a party in 3 hours. Meanwhile, Mary called the parents of the children, explaining the situation with a mix of nervousness and excitement. Bella, upon learning what was happening, got involved in the project with an enthusiasm that Edward hadn't seen in years. "Dad, Sophie loves unicorns. I saw her drawing them in her notebook, and her favorite color is purple." "How do you know that?" Edward asked, surprised by the knowledge his daughter had about Sophie. "We talk sometimes," Bella replied, blushing slightly. "She told me that when she grows up, she wants to be a veterinarian to take care of unicorns, even knowing they don't exist. She said it doesn't hurt to dream." At 5:15, when Sophie arrived from school accompanied by Mary, the living room of the mansion had been completely transformed. Purple and gold balloons decorated every corner. A table was filled with sweets and snacks, and in the center was a 3-tier cake shaped like a castle, with small sugar unicorns dancing around it. But what impressed Sophie the most was not the elaborate decoration. It was seeing 15 children from her class shouting, "Surprise!" when she walked through the door, realizing it was happening in the living room of the mansion, where she only managed to enter to clean. "Mum?" Sophie looked at Mary with wide eyes. "Is this real? Is it for me?" "It's all yours, Princess," Mary replied, kneeling down to hug her daughter. "But how?" Edward approached and crouched to the girl's height. "Happy birthday, Sophie. 9 years deserves a special party." Sophie looked around, absorbing every detail of the decoration, and then did something that surprised everyone. Instead of running to play with her friends, she hugged Edward tightly. "Thank you, Mr. Edward. You're the coolest dad in the world." The girl's words echoed in the room, and Edward felt a lump in his throat. Several mothers who had brought their Children looked at him curiously, clearly trying to understand the dynamics of that peculiar family. "Isn't that the businessman who's in the newspapers?" he heard one of the women whisper to another. "It is. But look how he treats the housekeeper's daughter. He can't be as bad as they say." During the next 2 hours, Edward experienced something completely new. He saw his daughter Bella playing naturally with children from a completely different social class, teaching them to dance and genuinely laughing. He watched Mary chatting with the other mothers, her initial nervousness giving way to a natural grace that enchanted everyone. But most importantly, he saw Sophie radiating pure happiness that made all the expenses and efforts seem insignificant. The girl was at the center of her own party, surrounded by friends, in an environment she normally only saw as her mother's workplace. The most touching moment came when Sophie asked to speak to everyone. She climbed onto a small chair and, with the adorable seriousness of children, said, "Guys, I want to thank everyone who came to my party, especially Mr. Edward, who let us use his beautiful house, and Bella, who taught me how to do braids in my hair." She looked directly at Edward. "And I want to thank you for giving me the best mom in the world, who works hard to give me everything I need." There was applause, some discreet tears among the mothers present, and Edward realized that this party had become something much bigger than a birthday celebration. It had turned into a family celebration, not the traditional family defined by blood or documents, but the family created by love and mutual care. When the last child left at 8 o'clock in the evening and they began to clean the room, Bella made an observation that surprised everyone. "You know, Dad, this was the most fun party we've ever had in this house, much better than those boring dinners with your clients." Edward looked at his daughter, then at Mary, who was helping Sophie put away the gifts, and finally at the room where a few purple balloons were still floating on the ceiling. For the first time in 5 years, that house truly felt alive. "You know what, Bella?" he said, putting his arm around his daughter's shoulders. "I completely agree with you." That night, as he tucked Sophie into bed, something that had become a special ritual since the school festival, Edward noticed that the girl was lovingly holding a small photo they took during the party. A photo where she was between him, Mary and Bella, all genuinely smiling. "Mr. Edward," Sophie said sleepily, "when I grow up, can I have a family like the one I have now?" The innocent question from the girl planted a seed in Edward's heart, a seed he wasn't ready to acknowledge yet, but one that was already starting to grow silently. October arrived with news that shook Edward's world even more. The federal police had discovered documents that definitively proved his innocence in the corruption scheme. Charles Mason, his former partner, had confessed in a plea deal that he had forged contracts and usurped the corporate identity of Mason Construction without Edward's knowledge. But the acquittal, while a legal relief, did not immediately erase the damage done to the company's reputation. It was a rainy Tuesday when Dr. Henry Smith arrived at the mansion with the official news. Edward welcomed him in the office, accompanied by Bella, who had insisted on being present. During the months of crisis, the teenager had become his greatest defender, maturing impressively. "The charges have been officially dropped," Dr. Smith announced, opening a folder full of documents. "The public prosecutor's office recognized that you were a victim, not an accomplice. But Edward," he paused significantly, "regaining credibility in the market will be a long process." "How long?" Edward asked. 2, maybe 3 years to return to the previous level. Some clients have already shown." Bella leaned forward in her chair. "And financially, how are we?" Edward looked at his daughter with a mix of pride and sadness. At 17, she was asking questions that she should only be asking as an adult. "Stable, but we need to be cautious," Dr. Smith replied. "The company has enough reserves, but the coming months will require careful management." After the lawyer left, father and daughter were alone in the office. The rain was pounding against the windows, creating a melancholic atmosphere that matched Edward's mood. "Dad," Bella said softly, "can I ask you something?" "Always." "Are you regretting fighting so hard to clear your name? It would have been easier to close the company and start something else." Edward considered the question for a few moments. "No, Bella. Some things are worth fighting for, even when it's hard. Integrity is one of them." Mary said the same thing, Bella commented casually. "When?" "Last week, when some boys at the new school were calling me the daughter of the corrupt. I came home crying, and Mary told me that sometimes people have to go through storms to prove what they are made of. She said you were showing what you were made of." Edward felt a wave of gratitude for the woman who had become much more than a housekeeper in his home. In recent months, Mary had been his emotional support, his unofficial advisor, and apparently also a motherly figure for Bella. At that moment, Sophie burst into the office like a small wet hurricane, her hair dripping with rainwater. "Mr. Edward! Mr. Edward!" she shouted, running directly to him. "Mommy said you're not going to prison anymore." Edward laughed for the first time in weeks, picking Sophie up and ignoring the fact that she was soaking his expensive suit. "I was never going to prison, little one. But it's true that the problems are over." "So can we have a party?" Sophie asked, her eyes shining. "Sophie!" Mary's voice came from the hallway. "Where are you? You can't run out in the rain like that." Mary appeared at the office door, clearly out of breath from chasing after her daughter. She was wearing a simple navy dress, and her hair was a bit messy, but Edward thought he had never seen her more beautiful. "I'm sorry," Mary said, trying to catch her breath. "Sophie heard you talking on the phone about the news and ran out before I could explain." "You don't need to apologize," Edward interrupted, still holding Sophie in his arms. "In fact, I think she had a good idea. How about we have a party after all?" "A party?" Mary questioned. "To celebrate the end of this difficult phase, and to thank the people who stood by us when everything seemed lost." Bella clapped her hands. "I love the idea. We can do it in the garden since the rain is supposed to stop tomorrow according to the weather forecast. And that's how, the following Saturday, the garden of the mansion in the gardens turned into the setting for a party that Edward had never imagined hosting. It wasn't a corporate event with sophisticated canapes and artificial conversations about business. It was a genuine celebration with simple yet heartfelt decorations, homemade food prepared by Mary, and an unusual mix of guests. Present were the few employees of the construction company who remained loyal during the crisis, some neighbors who had shown support, the children from Sophie's class with their parents, and even Dr. Smith with his family. Mrs. Thompson, the retired seamstress Edward had met at the school festival, had become a regular visitor to the house and was there with her famous cornbread cake. The most emotional moment of the party came when Mary asked for everyone's attention to make a toast. "I'm not good with speeches," she began, clearly nervous about speaking to such a diverse group, "but I wanted to thank everyone who is here, especially Edward." She looked directly at him. "Who in the past months has shown us that integrity is not just a pretty word, but a way of living." There was applause, and Edward felt his cheeks warm. "But mainly," Mary continued, "I want to thank you for allowing us to be part of this family. Because that's what we are, a chosen family, united not by blood but by mutual affection and respect." Edward stood up, asking for the improvised microphone they had set up. "Actually, I'm the one who needs to thank you. Mary," he looked at her, "you and Sophie have brought life back to this house. And Bella," he turned to his daughter, "you've taught me that sometimes we have to go through storms to discover who we really are." He paused, looking at all the faces around, a mix of social classes, ages and stories that would never meet under normal circumstances, but were there united by shared adversity. This crisis has taught me something important. It doesn't matter how many companies you have or how much money you possess. What matters are the people who stand by you when everything seems lost. You all are those people for me. Sophie, who had been playing with other children, ran up to Edward and tugged at his pants. "Mr. Edward," she said loud enough for everyone to hear, "now that the problems are over, does that mean you can be my real dad?" The silence that followed was deafening. Edward looked at Sophie, then at Mary, who was blushing, and finally at Bella, who was smiling with an expression he couldn't decipher. "Sophie," Mary quickly approached, "you can't say those things." "But why not, Mom?" Sophie insisted, with the devastating innocence of children. "Mr. Edward takes care of us. Bella is like an older sister. We all live in the same house. Isn't that a family?" Edward knelt down to the girl's level, aware that everyone was watching. "Sophie, what is a family?" "It's when people love each other and take care of one another, even when it's hard," she replied without hesitation, "and when they stick together even when storms come." Edward looked into the girl's brown eyes and saw a wisdom that many adults took years to develop. Then he looked at Mary, who was watching him with a mixed expression of hope and fear. "You know what, Sophie?" he finally said. "I think you're right. Families are about choosing to stay together, not about roles or titles." The party continued late into the night, but from that moment on, there was a different energy in the air. Words had been spoken that could not be taken back. Feelings had been expressed that forever changed the dynamic between them. That night, after everyone left and the house returned to silence, Edward found himself in the garden looking at the stars. Mary approached him, carrying 2 cups of tea. "Thank you," she said simply, offering him one of the cups. "Why?" "For not being embarrassed by what Sophie said. For responding with kindness instead of correcting her coldly." Edward took a sip of the tea, savoring the moment of peace after months of turmoil. "Mary, can I confess something?" "Of course." "For weeks, I've been thinking the same thing Sophie said today, about us being a family." Mary looked at him, and in the sparkle of her eyes, he saw that she had thought about it too. "And what do you think about that?" she asked softly. "I think Sophie is wiser than both of us," Edward replied, finally finding the courage to speak what he felt. "And I think it might be time to stop pretending this is just a work arrangement." Under the stars in the garden, surrounded by the scent of flowers blooming with the arrival of spring, Edward and Mary began a conversation that would change their lives forever. November arrived with the characteristic warmth of spring in New York, and Edward noticed that something fundamental had changed in the dynamics of the house since the October party. Sophie's words about family echoed constantly in his thoughts, and he noticed that Mary also seemed different, more relaxed, more present, as if an invisible barrier had been removed between them. It was a Thursday night when Edward made a decision he had been postponing for weeks. After putting Sophie to bed, a ritual that had become special for both of them, he sought out Mary in the garden, where she usually studied on warmer nights. He found her sitting on the wooden bench near the rosebush, with books spread out beside her and a focused expression as she solved math exercises. "How's the studying going?" he asked, sitting down next to her on the bench. "Well, the public service exam is in 4 months, and I feel more prepared than ever," Mary replied, closing her notebook. "But I didn't come here to talk about studies, did I?" Edward smiled. In recent months, they had developed a rapport that sometimes surprised him. "You know me well." "And you're nervous," she observed. "I can tell by your hands. You always tap your fingers when you're anxious." Edward looked at his own hands and realized he was indeed tapping his fingers on the bench. "Mary, for a few weeks, I've been thinking about our situation." "Our situation," she repeated, but Edward noticed that she knew exactly what he was talking about. "What we are to each other, what this strange family we've created means." He took a deep breath. "And I need to be honest about some feelings I've been developing." Mary fell silent, but Edward noticed she had stopped breathing for a moment. "When Helen died," he continued, looking at the roses blooming beside him, "I thought I would never be able to feel connection with another person again. I thought that part of me had died with her. And now I realize that the heart has an incredible capacity to heal and expand." Edward turned to look at her directly. "Mary, I've fallen in love with you." The words came out more directly than he had planned, and the silence that followed felt like an eternity. Mary lowered her eyes, her hands nervously intertwining in her lap. "Edward," she finally said, her voice almost a whisper, "You don't have to answer." "Now," he gently interrupted, "I just needed to speak. I needed you to know." "No." Mary shook her head, looking at him again. "I need to answer, because I've fallen in love with you too." Edward felt his heart race. "Really? How could I not fall in love with you?" She smiled shyly. "You've treated me with dignity from day one. You've cared for my daughter as if she were your own. You've supported my dreams when I doubted them myself. You've made me feel seen, valued." "Then why do you seem hesitant?" Mary sighed deeply. "Because I'm realistic, Edward. You're a wealthy businessman. I'm a housekeeper. You have a college education. I clean houses to survive. People will say, what kind of people? They'll say I'm opportunistic, that I took advantage of your vulnerability during the crisis, that I seduced my boss to secure financial stability." Edward felt a familiar anger rise in his chest, the same one he felt when he saw any kind of injustice. "And what do you think of those people?" I think I'm afraid they might be right." "Mary," Edward gently took her hands, "look at me." She raised her eyes, and Edward saw in them a mix of love and fear that broke his heart. "You have a college education. You're an exemplary mother. You study to improve your life. You have solid values and a strength of character that inspires me every day. If someone can't see that, the problem lies with that person's limited vision, not yours." "But the social differences are real, Edward. I wouldn't know how to behave in your social circles. I don't have the right clothes for fancy dinners. I don't know the rules of etiquette. Do you think this matters to me? It matters to the world you live in." Edward fell silent for a moment, considering her words. They were legitimate fears, based on a social reality he had observed many times. "Marissa, can I share something I've never told anyone?" She nodded. "My dad was a construction worker. My mum was a seamstress. I grew up in a 2-room house in Brooklyn, sharing a bedroom with 3 siblings." Edward looked at the mansion in the background. "All of this," he gestured to the house and garden, "was built with a lot of hard work, some luck and a few mistakes, but I never forgot where I came from." "Why didn't you ever tell me this?" "Because in the business world, a humble background is sometimes seen as a weakness. I learned to speak like them, dress like them, to pretend I always belonged to that world." Edward paused. "But you know what happened when the crisis hit? Most of those people disappeared. The ones who stayed were people like you. People of character, regardless of their bank account." Marissa absorbed his words in silence. "Besides," Edward continued, "you're assuming I want you to fit into my world. What if I'm tired of my world? What if what I want is to build a new world with you? What would that new world look like? It would be a world where Sophie could grow up knowing she is unconditionally loved, where Bella could have a nurturing mother figure again, where you could pursue your professional dreams without worrying about financial stability, and where he hesitated. Where you what? Where I could be happy again, truly happy, not just successful. Marissa looked at him for a long moment, and Edward saw the exact moment her defenses began to crumble. "Edward," she said softly, "if we stay together, everything will change. Our dynamic, how people see us, even how Sophie and Bella relate to each other." "I know, and I admit that scares me a little." "It scares me too," she confessed. "But you know what scares me more?" "What?" "The idea of letting the chance to build something real slip away because of fear of what others will think." Edward felt a wave of relief and joy. "So, what do we do?" Marissa smiled, and it was the most beautiful smile Edward had ever seen. "I think we start slow. We talk to the girls, see how they feel, and then we see what happens. And your exam, your plans for independence?" "They don't change," she replied firmly. "If we stay together, it will be because we choose to be together, not because I need you financially. My professional dreams are still important." "I completely agree." At that moment, a voice came from the porch of the house. "Dad, Marissa, can you come here?" It was Bella, and by the urgent tone of her voice, something had happened. "Do you think she overheard our conversation?" Marissa whispered, clearly nervous. "There's only one way." "To find out," Edward replied, standing up and offering his hand to her. As they walked hand in hand toward the house, Edward realized this was the first time they had touched in a romantic way. And he felt that, regardless of Bella's reaction, they had crossed a line from which there was no return. Their lives were about to change forever, and for the first time in years, Edward was eager to discover what the future held. Upon entering the living room, Edward and Marissa found a scene that completely caught them off guard. Bella was sitting on the leather sofa with Sophie nestled beside her, both looking at an old photo album spread out on the coffee table. The two girls had serious expressions, as if they were having an important conversation. "Did something happen?" Edward asked, discreetly letting go of Marissa's hand. "Sit down, Dad," Bella said, pointing to the armchair in front of the sofa. "You too, Marissa. We need to talk." Edward exchanged a worried glance with Marissa. They had planned to talk to the girls about their feelings, but they hadn't expected them to take the initiative. "Are you two okay?" Marissa asked carefully, sitting on the edge of the armchair. "We're fine," Sophie replied, but her voice was strangely serious for a 9-year-old. "It's just that we heard you talking in the garden." Edward's heart sank. "You heard everything," Bella added, but her tone was not accusatory. It was understanding. "And before you start explaining yourselves, we want to speak first." Edward looked at Marissa, who was visibly nervous, her hands tightly intertwined in her lap. "All right," he said cautiously. "We're listening." Bella took a deep breath, as if preparing for an important speech. "Dad, since Mom passed away, this house has become like a museum. Everything very beautiful, very organized, but without real life. You were always working, I was angry with everyone, and we barely talked." Edward felt a tightness in his chest, but he didn't interrupt. "Then Marissa and Sophie came," Bella continued, looking affectionately at the girl beside her, "and suddenly this house became a home again. There were birthday parties, laughter in the kitchen. You started having dinner with us instead of eating alone in the home office." "Bella," Edward began, but she raised her hand. "Let me finish, Dad. Please." She looked directly at Marissa. "Marissa, you taught me things that school never taught me. You taught me how to braid hair. You listened to me when I needed to cry. You helped me understand that feeling angry at my mom for dying was normal." Marissa felt her eyes fill with tears. "And Sophie," Bella turned to the girl, "you showed me what it's like to have a little sister. I never had that before, and it's amazing." Sophie smiled shyly. "You're an amazing sister too, even when I accidentally broke your expensive lipstick." Edward and Marissa couldn't help but smile at the innocence of the confession. "What the... Guys, what I mean is," Bella continued, "you two have been a family for months. The only difference is that you don't kiss." "Bella!" Edward exclaimed, feeling his cheeks heat up. "What? It's true. You care for each other, worry about each other, talk about everything." Bella shrugged. "In my school, there are many different families. Some kids live with their grandparents, some have 2 dads or 2 mums, and some have been adopted. What matters is if people love and take care of each other." Sophie leaned forward, her brown eyes shining. "And you love each other? We can see it in the way you look at each other." "What do you mean?" Mary asked, curious despite her nervousness. "Mr. Edward always smiles differently when Mom walks into the room," Sophie explained seriously. "And Mom always fixes her hair when she hears him coming home." Edward looked at Mary, who was blushing intensely. It was true. He had noticed he always felt happier when she was around, but he didn't realize it was so obvious. "And there's more," Bella added. "Dad, you spent 3 hours picking out a gift for Sophie's birthday. 3 hours. You've never spent that much time picking a gift for me." "That's not true," Edward protested, but then he realized it might be true. "And Mary," Bella continued relentlessly, "always asks if you had lunch when you're traveling for work, and she gets worried when you come home late." Mary opened her mouth to protest but couldn't deny it. Sophie got up from the couch and approached Edward and Mary. "Guys, you are so clueless," she said with the devastating frankness of children. "Sophie," Mary automatically reprimanded. "But it's true, Mom. You worry about what other people will think, but you forget that the most important people are already here." She gestured to herself and Bella. "And we just want you to be happy." The silence that followed was heavy with emotion. Edward looked at the 2 girls, his daughter, who had matured so much in the past few months, and Sophie, who spoke with a wisdom that surprised him for her age. "Girls," he finally said, "are you sure you would feel comfortable if Mary and if we were together?" "Dad," Bella sighed dramatically, "we're asking you to be together. And would that mean you would be my real dad?" Sophie asked, her eyes filled with hope. Edward looked at Mary, who was clearly emotional. "Sophie, even if your mum and I were together, you already have a biological dad." "Who never called or sent a birthday card," Sophie interrupted with surprising maturity. "Mr. Edward is the one who takes care of me, who drives me to school when I'm sick, who teaches me to ride my bike. To me, that's what being a dad is." Mary got up from the chair and knelt in front of her daughter. "Sweetheart, are you sure? Because if Edward and I get together, our lives will change a lot. We might move to another neighborhood. You might have to change schools." "Mum," Sophie took Mary's face in her little hands, "I just want you to be happy, and you're happier here with us than you were before." Edward felt a lump in his throat. He also stood up and knelt beside Mary. "And you, Bella, how would you feel if Mary became more than a housekeeper in our family?" Bella rolled her eyes. "Dad, Mary has been more than a housekeeper for months. She's like a second mom, a chosen mom." She paused. "And I would really like to have a mum again, and to have a little sister officially." Tears finally escaped from Mary's eyes. "Bella. And besides," Bella added with a mischievous smile, "someone needs to teach Dad how to be romantic. Because giving flowers every week but never kissing the person is really weird." "You knew about the flowers?" Edward asked, surprised. "Dad, I live here. Of course I know you buy roses for Mary every Friday and leave them in her room pretending it's to beautify the house." Edward looked at Mary, who was smiling through her tears. "You knew I left the flowers?" "Of course I did," she replied softly, "and they were the most beautiful roses I've ever received in my life." Sophie clapped her hands. "So it's decided. You two are going to date." "Sophie, it's not that simple," Edward began. "Why not?" Bella asked. "You love each other, we approve, you're happy together. What more do you need?" Edward looked at Mary, then at the two girls who were watching them expectantly. He realized they were right. They were already a family in every way that mattered. The only thing missing was to officially acknowledge what everyone already knew. "Mary," he said, gently taking her hand, "can I ask you an official question?" She nodded, her eyes sparkling with anticipation. "Would you like to date me?" "Finally!" Bella and Sophie exclaimed in unison, making everyone laugh. "Yes," Mary replied, squeezing his hand. "I would love to." And there, in the living room of the mansion, surrounded by the two most important girls in their lives, Edward and Mary sealed with a shy kiss the official beginning of something that had been quietly growing for months. That night, when the girls finally went to sleep after hours of animated conversation about plans for the future, Edward and Mary found each other again in the garden. "I can't believe our daughters scolded us for being too slow," Edward said, laughing. "Our daughters," Mary repeated, savoring the words. "I like how that sounds." "Me too," Edward agreed, pulling her closer. "And you? Are you regretting agreeing to date a stubborn workaholic businessman?" "Never," she replied, resting her head on his shoulder. "But you will have to improve your romantic skills. The flowers are a good start. But it needs more creativity." Edward laughed, kissing the top of her head. "I accept the challenge." Under the November stars, with the scent of roses filling the air, Edward and Mary officially began to write the next chapter of their lives. No longer as boss and housekeeper, but as a man and a woman who had found love when they least expected it. December arrived in New York, bringing with it the intense warmth of summer and an atmosphere of renewal that seemed to permeate every corner of the mansion in the gardens. Edward woke up that Saturday morning, December 15th, with a sense of fulfillment he hadn't felt in years. Beside him, Mary slept peacefully, her brown hair spread over the silk pillow. They had gotten married civilly the week before, in an intimate ceremony at the courthouse, with only Bella and Sophie as witnesses. The sound of laughter coming from the garden made Edward smile. Through the window, he could see Bella teaching Sophie to skate on new skates in the paved area near the pool. His daughter's transformation in recent months had been extraordinary. From a rebellious and bitter teenager, she had become a caring older sister and a true companion. "Good morning, husband." Mary's soft voice pulled him from his thoughts. Edward turned to find the brown eyes that had become his anchor. "Good morning, wife. It still sounds strange, doesn't it?" "Strange, but perfect," she replied, snuggling into his arms. "Can you believe that a year ago you were just my boss? A year ago I was a lost man who didn't know what really mattered in life," Edward corrected, kissing her forehead. "You brought me back." Mary got out of bed and walked to the window, watching the girls in the garden. She wore a simple cotton nightgown, but Edward thought he had never seen her more beautiful. The morning sun created a golden halo around her silhouette, and he wondered how he had gotten so lucky. "Edward," she said, without turning around, "I need to tell you something." The serious tone in her voice made Edward sit up in bed. "What is it?" Mary took a deep breath before turning to look at him. "I received the results of the exam yesterday. I placed second." Edward felt a mix of joy and apprehension. "Mary, that's wonderful. Why didn't you tell me yesterday?" "Because I was afraid of your reaction," she confessed, sitting back down on the bed. "Being accepted means I can choose where to work, and I chose the school where Sophie studied before, the same one from the school festival." "And why does that worry you?" "Because it means I will work as a teacher, not as a homemaker. It means busy schedules, parent meetings, tests to grade. Our dynamic will change completely." Edward took her hands in his. Mary, do you really think I would marry a qualified educator and expect her to stay home cooking for me? That's not it, it's just that... It's that you still fear I will be like the other rich men you've known, Edward gently completed. That I want a trophy wife instead of a partner. Mary lowered her eyes. Maybe. Look at me, Edward asked, gently lifting her chin. I fell in love with your intelligence, your determination, your strength. Why on earth would I want you to give up those qualities? What if I can't handle everything? Being a teacher, a wife, a mother to the two girls. Then we will figure out together how to balance it all. We'll hire a housekeeper to help with the house. I'll reorganize my schedule to be more present. We'll do whatever it takes. Tears shimmered in Mary's eyes. Are you sure? I'm sure I want to see you achieving your dreams, Edward replied, kissing her hands. And I'm sure our daughters will be proud to have a mother who is a teacher. Our daughters, Mary repeated, smiling through her tears. I still get emotional when you talk like that. At that moment, Sophie burst into the room like a small panting hurricane. Mom, Dad Edward, Bella taught me how to do a spin on my skates. Edward smiled at hearing Sophie call him Dad Edward, a middle ground she had found to honor both Edward and her need for time to adjust to the new family dynamic. That's amazing, Princess, he said, picking her up. But you should knock before entering the room. Sorry, Sophie said, but she was clearly too excited to care about etiquette. Mum, can you come watch me do the spin? Please? Of course. Let's get dressed and we'll be right down. Sophie ran back to the garden, and Edward and Mary exchanged an amused glance. I think our honeymoon is over, Mary joked. Our honeymoon will last forever, Edward replied, kissing her softly. It will just be busier. An hour later, the family was gathered in the kitchen for Saturday morning coffee, a ritual they had established since getting married. Bella was making pancakes, her new culinary passion, while Sophie helped set the table. Edward was making coffee, and Mary was arranging fresh fruit on a platter. Dad, Bella said, expertly flipping a pancake, can I ask a question? Always. Are you and Mary going to have more kids? Edward nearly spilled his coffee cup. Mary stopped mid-motion of slicing strawberries. Sophie looked up, intrigued. Bella, Mary exclaimed, what kind of question is that? A normal question, Bella replied casually. You're married, you're still young. It would be nice if Sophie and I had a little brother or sister. I would like a little brother, Sophie declared immediately. I could teach him how to skate. Edward looked at Mary, who was visibly embarrassed. It was a conversation they hadn't had alone yet. Girls, he said carefully, that's something Mary and I need to discuss first, between us. But you guys are going to talk, right? Insisted Sophie. Because I've already thought of names. If it's a boy, it could be Gabriel. If it's a girl, it could be Helen, like Bella's first mum. The silence that followed was heavy with emotion. Edward felt a lump in his throat, hearing his late wife's name being suggested so lovingly by Sophie. Sophie, Mary said gently, that's a very special name. Are you sure? I am. Mrs. Helen was nice, and it would be a way for her to continue being part of the family. Bella approached Sophie and hugged her. You're amazing, you know that? I know, Sophie replied with the adorable simplicity of children, making everyone laugh. After breakfast, while the girls watched a movie in the living room, Edward and Mary met in his home office for a conversation that had been postponed. So, Edward said, sitting next to her on the leather sofa, children. Children, Mary repeated, nervously intertwining her fingers. What do you think? I think it would be amazing, but I want to know what you think. I'm 36, Edward. If we want to have children, we can't wait too long. And do you want to? Mary looked at him, and Edward saw the answer in the sparkle of her eyes even before she spoke. I do. Very much. Then let's try, he said simply, kissing her hand. But no pressure. If it happens, it happens. If it doesn't, we already have two wonderful daughters. Edward, Mary said softly, can I confess something? Always. Sometimes I still can't believe all of this is real, that I have a husband who supports me, daughters who love me, a career that is just starting. It's like a dream too good to be true. Edward pulled her into his arms. It's real, my love, and do you know why? Why? Because we built this together. It wasn't luck or chance. It was a choice, yours, mine, the girls'. We chose to be a family. That afternoon, the family gathered in the garden for an afternoon of swimming and barbecue. Edward watched Mary helping Sophie float in the shallow end of the pool, while Bella practiced diving in the deep end. The golden sun of late afternoon created magical reflections on the water, and he thought about how that scene perfectly represented the life they had built together. His phone rang. It was Dr. Smith with news about the construction company. Edward, the lawyer said, I have good news. The last big client who cancelled the contract wants to resume the partnership. Your reputation is completely clear in the market. That's great, Doctor. Thank you for everything. Actually, I wanted to talk about something else. I'm retiring next year and would like to recommend you to take on some pro bono cases I've been handling. I work with low-income families on labor law issues. Edward looked at Mary, who was laughing as Sophie tried to splash water on her. You know, Doctor, I think I would really like that. Send me the details. Change of perspectives? Dr. Smith asked, clearly surprised. Change of priorities, Edward corrected. I've learned that success without purpose is empty. After hanging up the phone, Edward joined the family in the pool. Bella immediately challenged him to a diving competition, while Sophie insisted he help her make a mermaid in the water. Dad Edward, Sophie said as he helped her float, are you happy now? The girl's simple question caught him off guard. Edward looked around at Mary, who was watching him with love in her eyes, at Bella, who had regained the joy he thought she had lost forever, at Sophie, who had taught him that family is about choice, not just blood. I'm very happy, Princess, he replied, lifting her into his arms, happier than I ever thought possible. That night, after the girls went to sleep, Edward and Mary sat in the garden where it all began months before. The roses he had planted especially for her were in full bloom, filling the air with their sweet fragrance. You know what impresses me most about this whole story? Mary said, snuggling into his arms. What? It started with Sophie defending me. An 8-year-old had the courage to stand up to an angry teenager to protect her mom, and that changed everything. Sophie always knew what really matters, Edward agreed. We adults are the ones who complicate things. And now, what comes next? Edward looked at the stars that were beginning to appear in the New York sky. Now we live. We raise our daughters. You pursue your professional dreams. I learn to balance work and family, and we simply are happy. Is it that simple? True love is always simple, Edward replied, kissing the top of her head. It's the people who make it complicated. Under the starry December sky, surrounded by the scent of roses and the distant sounds of the city pulsing around them, Edward and Mary savoured the comfortable silence of those who have finally found their place in the world. The next morning would bring new challenges. Mary's first day of work as a teacher, important meetings at the construction company, the constant responsibilities of raising two daughters. But all of that felt manageable now, because they wouldn't face it alone. They had built something that seemed impossible at first, a true family, based on mutual respect, unconditional love, and the courage to choose happiness over social conventions. And it all began with the sound of breaking glass and a little girl defending her mom with tears in her eyes. Sometimes, Edward thought, the greatest miracles start with the simplest gestures of love and courage.